Eighth grade, hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be going through not so much the military battles that happened during the Civil War, but more what the impact was for those who were not fighting in the war. And of course, in a civil war, in any war, there's tremendous impact for those left behind to take care of the home. So this will be a little bit about those and what the economic and political effects were of the war while it was going on. So, to begin, to begin, I apologize. There are quite a few notes today, but we're going over life in the Civil War, and there's a lot to that. So, it is what it is. It's very difficult during war, physically, emotionally, and financially for definitely soldiers, but also the people that are left behind, take care of the families and the businesses. So, most men in the North and the South between 1840 left their homes to fight in the war. And during this time, only about half of the 12 million school age children attended school. And a large part of this was due to the fact that since the men were fighting in the war, children had to stay home and do a lot of the work that the men would have normally done had they been home. The other reason for this was, especially in the South, it could have been dangerous to go to school, depending on where you were, if you were in the path of an advancing army. And so many schools and churches were actually converted temporarily to be hospitals for soldiers that were injured during the war. In the South, this is where most of the fighting took place. So there was a lot of shortages of goods and necessary um, food supplies and rations, and so we'll get to that later on in the video as well. They had very little factories, and the blockades that the Union was putting on their eastern seaboard caused shortages of basically every imaginable finished good because they couldn't make them themselves. They didn't have the factories to do so, and they couldn't trade with anybody else to get them. That was definitely the Union's plan with the Anaconda Plan. For women, many left home to be battlefield nurses. Those who remained home worked. They did the jobs that the men normally would have done in farms or factories or ran offices. They were teachers of schools for the children that did attend school, and they would keep government records as well. Some women even served as spies for both the Union and the South. Perhaps the most famous here, Harriet Tubman, who led a mission into the South and freed 100 slaves undercover, disguising herself as a slave. A lot of, in some cases, women disguised themselves as men and actually fought in the battles themselves. So the prison camp. So at first, when the North and South were fighting, when an opposing side would surrender, they would typically just hold them and then exchange them for troops that were captured on the other side, right? But what they realized is that, well, then these men just go back and then we see them in the next battle, and so we need to keep them for longer. We can't just give them back every time that we've captured them. So they set up these prison camps, which, again, think about all the shortages that are happening in the country. Prisoners are among the least well taken care for during this time, and especially when your prisoners are basically the people who are causing all the shortages, in their opinion, right? If a Union soldier is captured and life is hard in the South, well, a lot of the soldiers will believe that Union soldier is responsible for the difficulty that they're facing. So in Andersonville, there was a prison. This is in Georgia. This is probably the most infamous of the prison camps. It was initially built to hold 10,000 soldiers, but it ended up holding 33,000, 13,000 of which are going to end up perishing in the Andersonville prison camp. They were given a tablespoon of salt, 3 tablespoons of beans, and 8 ounces of cornmeal daily, and that's it to survive on, which is obviously not enough to survive on. This with disease and sickness that went throughout the camp because of the malnourishment led to the very high volume of deaths as we see here. Um, This also occurred in New York as well. There was another prison camp there, and the conditions were very similar, except it was freezing cold all the time because it was New York in the winter. All right. So a lot of political and economic changes in the South. You have to remember that at the very beginning of this, most Southerners did not own slaves. And so there was a large portion of Southerners who actually were opposed to the war at the start. And then after the war continues on, they have all these shortages, all this death, all this destruction of their fields that they are working. Many more begin to oppose it. And we see this in bread riots, which erupted throughout the South, which is basically women and children who are starving. Going and looting stores to get food and to get the necessary means to survive, because essentially the reason they don't have all these things is because of a war that was started that they didn't want in the first place. And the sun is shining just directly in my eyes. I don't know if you guys see that. Okay. All right. So I'm going to try and get through the rest of this with my eyes barely open. And I forgot to set my timer, so I'm going to try and go quick. In the North, almost all Democrats in the North opposed the war, because remember, the Democrats were at the time a pro-slavery party. So many believed negotiations would bring the South back into the Union. And there was a lot of dissension. A lot of people who disagreed with Lincoln disagreed with the war. And so Lincoln actually suspended some civil liberties, such as habeas corpus, to basically keep the peace, right? And basically it's suspending freedoms or liberties to protect the people, which I think is a major argument that we're undergoing right now with the coronavirus, right? A lot of people feel like their liberties, their freedoms are being suspended or taken away from them because they're not allowed to travel as they'd please. But the government's justification, of course, is that it's for their own good, right? It's for the benefit of our society. So certainly a hard decision. I don't know if there's any right answer there. But Lincoln did suspend the writ of habeas corpus, which is often suspended during wartime. And thousands of Northerners were jailed without trials, many of whom who had taken steps to help the Confederacy. Habeas corpus is basically the rights that are guaranteed to us in the Bill of Rights, the right to a trial and protection against unlawful imprisonments. So this basically streamlined convictions where they could say, you've been helping the Confederacy and now you're going to jail, without going through the entire legal process outlined in the Bill of Rights. Also, as the war went on, draft laws were passed, which required people to serve in the Army. Both the North and the South did have exceptions. In the South, if you owned 30 or more slaves, you were permitted to not be drafted because the idea was that you had to stay and take care of your plantation, which was certainly necessary given all the food shortages happening in the South. But more commonly, the exceptions were made through money. If you could pay the government so much money, they would allow you not to serve because the government desperately needed money, which we'll talk about in just a second. People didn't like this, obviously. Riots took place, especially in the North. The video linked at the bottom here, I recommend you watch, just 4 minutes on the draft riots in New York City. Essentially, it was mostly poor Irish immigrants who felt like, first of all, that the Emancipation Proclamation would cost them their jobs, right? That now that Lincoln had freed African Americans, they would come and take the lowest paying jobs in New York City, which the Irish immigrants had at the time. And then there was also this feeling of a unconstitutional nature to the drafting, right? That this was not permitted in the Constitution. And so this was not a legal decision made by Abraham Lincoln. There was another note here that I wanted to mention, but I can't remember off the top of my head. The ending results of this is that 100 people died in the draft riots, many of whom were African Americans. African Americans were lynched in the streets of New York City. A black orphanage was burned. And again, just very gross racist behavior, which was very common of the times. Eventually, Lincoln will send in federal troops to stop the rebellion, and it ends almost as quickly as it started. All right, so you have three ways of paying for a war, and they use pretty much all three of these. Borrow money by selling war bonds that promise high interest. So basically, how war bonds work is the government will sell you a $100 war bond for $50, right? So if you pay the government $50, they'll give you this piece of paper that says in X amount of years, let's say 30 years, we'll pay you back $100. So this was an incentive for people who wanted to make long-term investments with very high return on their investment. It also helped their government, who desperately needed the money at the time. So war bonds were very common. Income taxes, property taxes, new taxes were established, and printing money. But of course, you have to be careful with that, because if you print too much money, that will lead to, as we know, inflation. All right, this is the last slide, and there's a lot on here, but I'm going to try and go kind of quickly through here. Basically, the war helped the northern economy, and it greatly hurt the southern economy. Because the North had factories, they were already the industrial economy. War is great for that, right? You have to create things like guns, ammunition, shoes, uniforms. Farmers now prospered because the South was no longer selling goods to the North. And so they were the sole supplier, in many cases, of food to the North, which is also in a war and also needs a lot of food. But because the demand was so high, prices raised faster than wages. And this caused some inflation, and really was most difficult for the lower classes, because they couldn't afford it once the demand rose. In the South, we have the exact opposite effect. Because the war is happening in the South, Southern plantations are being destroyed, their food sources are being destroyed, and the blockade is keeping new goods, any finished products really, from coming into the South. And so there's a shortage of basically every manufactured basic necessity, some foodstuffs, but especially salt, which was not a resource natural to the South and had to be imported. And of course, we know salt was very important for preserving food. If you can't preserve food, that creates further shortages of food. And inflation was a lot worse in the South because their currency hadn't been recognized or established long enough to really have value to it. And as the South kept needing more things, they just kept printing more money, which definitely causes inflation, and that is definitely bad. I might have gone over my 15 minutes here. I'm really not sure because I don't have my timer. But if not, please make sure you go back through this and pause at each slide and get the notes down for me, please. Thank you.